He arrived with a bag and a belief. The bag contained everything a 17-year-old from Manhasset, New York needed for his first semester at a university. The belief was simpler and more fragile, that he was there because the university had decided he was worth having. That somewhere in the administrative structure of Syracuse University, a decision had been made about Jim Brown, and the decision was yes. The decision had not been made. What had been made, instead, was an arrangement. And the arrangement was not between Jim Brown and Syracuse University. It was between a man named Kenneth Molloy and his own conscience, his own resources, and his own understanding of what was owed to a young man whose talent he had watched up close for years and whose future he had decided, without being asked, to help make possible. Jim Brown unpacked his bag in a dormitory room that was not the athlete's dormitory. He was housed separately. Not an accident, not an oversight, but a policy, the specific expression of what Syracuse University's relationship to its black athletes looked like in the autumn of 1953. He would learn other expressions of that relationship in the days and weeks that followed the coaching staff's decision to move him from running back to punter, to lineman, to anywhere except the position he had been recruited for and excelled at. The racist taunts from the stands during practice, the warning against socializing with white women on campus. He was the only black player on the freshman football team. He did not know yet about the money. He did not know that the scholarship he believed he had was not a scholarship at all. That the funds covering his tuition had come from a single man's pocket and a collection of contributions that man had organized, and that the university itself had offered nothing. He was operating, in those first weeks, on a foundation that he believed was solid, and that was, in fact, held together by the private commitment of a man who had decided that Jim Brown needed to be at Syracuse, and had made that happen through the only means available to him. Kenneth Molloy had not told him. He would not tell him for a very long time. Kenneth Molloy was a lawyer from Manhasset, New York, a former lacrosse player at Syracuse University, a man who had maintained his connection to the athletic programs at both his alma mater and his community long after his own playing days were finished. He had watched Jim Brown play in Manhasset through the years of his high school career, watching across 5 sports with the particular attention of a man who understood what athletic excellence looked like and recognized, in what Brown was doing on those fields and courts, something that exceeded the category. He was not a scout. He was not a coach. He was a lawyer who loved sports and loved his community and had, through the accumulation of years of involvement, developed relationships at Syracuse that gave him access to the people who made decisions about who the university admitted and on what terms. He used those relationships. He went to Syracuse and argued for Jim Brown's admission with the focused persistence of a man who understood that he was making a case that the institution was not inclined to accept, and that the case needed to be made anyway. He argued on the merits, the athletic record, the academic standing, the specific quality of what Jim Brown had demonstrated across 5 sports at Manhasset High School. He argued against the institutional resistance that expressed itself in the language of policy and procedure, but was rooted in something simpler and uglier. Syracuse in 1953 did not want black athletes. Molloy himself said so, directly, without softening it. The university was not persuaded by the argument alone. What it agreed to was a condition: if Molloy could fund Brown's first year, and if Brown proved as good as advertised once he arrived, the university would put him on scholarship from his sophomore year onward. This was not a generous offer. It was a trial. It said, show us, on your own dime, that this black kid from Manhasset is worth our investment, and then we will consider investing. Molloy accepted the condition. He had no choice if the outcome he wanted was Jim Brown at Syracuse. He raised the money from the community of Manhasset, from the 45 men who contributed, from his own resources when the contributions fell short. And then, when the promised scholarship for the second semester of Brown's freshman year was not honored, He paid the remainder himself. He did all of this without telling Jim Brown where the money was coming from. He told Brown that Syracuse had given him a scholarship. The lie was not casual. It was deliberate. The specific decision of a man who understood that Jim Brown, arriving at a university that did not want him, facing a coaching staff that would move him away from his natural position, and a campus culture that would remind him at every turn of the limits of his welcome, needed to believe that the institution had chosen him, that he was there because the university had decided he was worth having. The truth? That he was there because one man had decided it and had paid for it himself, was a truth that Molloy chose to carry alone. The freshman year was difficult in ways that the scholarship question was only the beginning of. Jim Brown arrived at Syracuse in September of 1953 with the talent that everyone who had watched him play already knew about, and with something else. The specific interior quality that the talent was built on top of, the refusal to be diminished by circumstances, the discipline of doing the work regardless of what the surrounding environment was doing. These qualities were real, and they were significant, and they were, in the autumn of 1953 at Syracuse University, tested in ways that would have ended most people's stories before the second chapter. He was housed in a non-athlete dormitory. The signal this sent was clear, and was intended to be clear: you are not quite one of them. You are here, but you are not here in the same way. Your presence is conditional, and the conditions are ours to set. The coaching staff placed him at fifth-string tailback, not because his ability placed him there. Everyone who had seen him play understood that his ability placed him nowhere near fifth string, but because the position at the front of the depth chart was occupied by white players and the organizational logic of the program, in 1953, did not easily accommodate a black player in front of them. They suggested other positions: punter, lineman, positions where his talent would be used without requiring the program to place a black player at its most visible position. He endured the taunts, the specific, deliberate cruelty of young men who understood that the institution's architecture supported their cruelty, and who used that support the way people use any resource that is freely available to them. He heard what they said, and he continued doing what he had come to do. He nearly left. This is the part of the story that is most important and least told. The fact that Jim Brown, in the autumn of 1953, came close to packing the bag he had unpacked in the non-athlete dormitory and returning to Manhasset. The combination of the institutional hostility and the personal cruelty and the specific degradation of being moved away from the position he had excelled at was, at certain moments in that first year, enough to make leaving seem like the reasonable response. He did not leave. The reasons he stayed are his own and are not fully available to the outside account. But among them, visible in what he said about that year and the years afterward, was the belief. The false but sustaining belief that Molloy had given him, that the university had chosen him, that he was there because a decision had been made at the institutional level that he was worth having, that leaving would be leaving something that had been offered to him, not escaping something that was trying to push him out. The scholarship that did not exist kept him at Syracuse long enough to earn the scholarship that did. He played his sophomore year at running back. The coaching staff, confronted with the evidence of what Jim Brown actually was when given the opportunity to be it, could not maintain the positions they had taken in his freshman year without making their own institutional dishonesty visible. He was put where he belonged. He was given the ball and allowed to do with it what he had been doing since before anyone at Syracuse had any idea who he was. What he did was extraordinary. Not surprisingly extraordinary. The coaches and the players who had watched him in practice had known what was coming. But visibly, documentably, undeniably extraordinary, in the public context of games that produced statistics and film, and the particular kind of evidence that institutions cannot ignore. He earned the scholarship, not from the university's generosity, The university had shown nothing that resembled generosity in its dealings with Jim Brown. He earned it in the specific sense of forcing the institution to honor the condition it had set, by doing on the field what Molloy had told them he would do, by being as good as advertised in a context where the advertising had not been sufficient to produce the scholarship that should have preceded his arrival. His junior year, his senior year, the records accumulated in the way that Jim Brown's records always accumulated, not in bursts, not in single spectacular moments that could be isolated and admired in the abstract, but through the sustained application of something that could not be contained by the usual methods. He scored 43 points in a single game against Colgate, 196 yards, 6 touchdowns, 7 extra points. In a performance that set an NCAA record that stood for decades, he led Syracuse to the Cotton Bowl. He was a unanimous first-team All-American. He finished 5th in the Heisman Trophy voting in a year when the winner was white and Syracuse was black, and the mathematics of the award were not separable from the mathematics of the era. He was the greatest athlete in Syracuse University's history. The institution that had not wanted him, that had housed him in a separate dormitory and moved him to 5th string, and failed to honor the scholarship it had promised, that institution had produced, through its own resistance and despite itself, the clearest possible demonstration of what it had tried to exclude. Kenneth Molloy watched all of this from Manhasset. He watched with the satisfaction of a man whose bet had paid off in ways that exceeded what the bet had been for. Not just a promising athlete at a university, but something larger, something that the 4 years at Syracuse had made possible in a way that nothing else could have. He watched, and he continued to carry, quietly, the truth of what had actually happened in the autumn of 1953. He did not tell Jim Brown. The NFL draft came in 1957, Cleveland Browns, 6th overall pick. The beginning of 9 seasons that would produce records that stood for decades and a legacy that the game had not seen before and has not fully replicated since. And still Molloy did not tell him. He watched the rookie season, the 237 yards against the Rams in the 9th game, the rushing title, the MVP, the immediate and complete demonstration that what had been true at Manhasset and at Syracuse was true at every level the game could produce. He watched and he maintained the silence he had maintained since 1953, the silence that was not deception exactly but was the continuation of a decision he had made. To give Jim Brown something and to ask nothing for it, not even the acknowledgement of having given it. Jim Brown learned the truth later. Not in the first year of his professional career, not during the Syracuse years themselves, but afterward, in the accumulation of time and relationship, and the specific kind of honesty that grows between people who have known each other for a long time and have arrived at the place where the truth can be received, when he understood what Molloy had done, what the man had actually done in 1953, with his own money and his own access and his own decision that Jim Brown needed to be at Syracuse and that the university was not going to make that happen, and that someone therefore had to. The response was not what Molloy had protected him from, not the doubt, not the conditional belonging, not the sense of being there on borrowed terms. The response was something that only becomes available once the work is done and the years have passed and the truth can be held alongside the outcome it produced. He wrote about Molloy in his memoir. He called him a man who lives his life for others, especially kids. He said, "I love Kenneth. I am proud to be his friend. Not thank you for the money. Not, I would not have made it without you." Something more complete and less transactional. The recognition of a man who had understood what was needed and had provided it, quietly and without asking to be acknowledged, and had carried the secret of having done so for years because the acknowledgement was not what the doing was for. 2. Kenneth Molloy died in 1999. Jim Brown outlived him by 24 years, dying in Los Angeles in May of 2023 at 87 years old. In the decades between Molloy's death and his own, Jim Brown spoke about the man with a consistency and a specificity that the sports world focused on the rushing titles and the championships, did not always fully register. He spoke about what Molloy had understood. Not just about football, about the specific thing that needed to happen in 1953, about the gap between what Jim Brown was capable of and the institutional barriers that were designed to prevent that capability from expressing itself, and about the decision that a man with access and resources and a clear view of the situation could make when he encountered that gap. Molloy had not waited for the institution to do the right thing. He had understood that the institution was not going to do the right thing, and he had stepped into the space that the institution's failure created and filled it with his own resources and his own commitment. This is not a romantic story about individual goodness solving what systemic failure produced. It is a more complicated story than that. Jim Brown still arrived at a university that did not want him. He was still housed in a separate dormitory and pushed away from his natural position and subjected to the cruelty of a campus culture that the institution's architecture supported. Molloy's money got him through the door. It did not change what was on the other side of the door. What it did was give Jim Brown the chance to be the thing that changed it himself. The chance to play. The chance to produce the evidence that the institution's resistance could not ignore. The chance to earn, through the only means that was actually available to him, the standing that should have been offered before he arrived. He took the chance, and he did what Jim Brown did. With every chance the game gave him, he ran through it, around it, past it, and beyond it, until the argument against his presence had been buried under the weight of what his presence had produced. But the chance began with one man's decision, a lawyer from Manhasset who watched a 17-year-old play 5 sports and understood, without being asked, that someone was going to have to make it possible for that 17-year-old to become what he was capable of becoming, and that the someone was going to have to be him. He paid. He stayed silent. He watched. And Jim Brown ran. He ran at Syracuse, and he ran in Cleveland, and he ran through every barrier and every scheme and every institutional resistance that the world organized against him. He ran on the ground that Kenneth Molloy had made, not the ground of the football field, but the deeper ground, the ground of possibility, the ground that only exists when someone decides that what they are witnessing matters enough to put something real on the line for it. Molloy put everything on the line. His money, his relationships, his willingness to carry a secret for years because the secret was the right thing for Jim Brown and the right thing mattered more than the acknowledgement. Jim Brown ran on that ground for the rest of his life. He knew. In the end, he always knew. And when he said, "I love Kenneth, I am proud to be his friend," those words were not gratitude exactly. They were recognition. The recognition of a man who understood, finally and completely, what it had taken to put him in the position to become what he became. The ground was real. Molloy had made it. Jim Brown had done the rest. There is a particular kind of generosity that does not announce itself, that does not wait for the recipient to understand what is being given or to say thank you or to acknowledge the gift in any way. It simply gives and then disappears back into the ordinary life of the person who gave it, carrying no expectation of return, asking nothing in exchange for what it provided. Kenneth Molloy had this kind of generosity. He had gone to Syracuse and made the argument, and raised the money, and carried the lie that was not quite a lie. The protective fiction that gave Jim Brown the belonging he needed to stay in a place that was trying to push him out. He had done all of this and then stepped back and watched what happened with the particular quiet satisfaction of a man who understands that the thing he set in motion is larger than the setting in motion. What he watched was this: Jim Brown, the only black player on the freshman football team in 1953, buried at 5th string on the depth chart in a dormitory that was not the athlete's dormitory, subject to the cruelty of a campus culture that the institution's architecture supported. That Jim Brown endured, and came back in his sophomore year, and earned his place at running back through the evidence of what he produced when given the opportunity to produce it. And built, over 4 years at Syracuse, a record that the institution's history would be permanently associated with whether the institution wanted the association or not. Jim Brown became, in the years that followed Syracuse, the most dominant running back in the history of professional football. He became the man whose name the sports writers reached for when they were looking for the standard against which every subsequent player at his position would be measured. He became the man who walked away at 30, at the peak of everything, because his life was his to direct and the life had other things in it besides football. And he became, in the decades of the post-football life, the films, the activism, the American program, the decades of engagement with the world beyond the white lines, the demonstration of what it meant when the thing inside a person was given room to fully express itself, when the barriers that should have kept it contained were circumvented by one man's decision and his own resources and his willingness to carry a secret for years. Kenneth Molloy made the room. Jim Brown filled it. That is the story that the rushing titles and the Pro Bowl selections and the records in the books do not tell. The story of the room that was made before any of it was possible. The man who made it. The secret he carried, and the 17-year-old who arrived with a bag and a belief that was not entirely true, and that was, in the end, exactly what he needed to become what the world was not yet ready to understand he already was. The ground was real. It had always been real. Molloy had simply been the one who made it solid enough to run on. Jim Brown ran. He always ran.